Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we're joined as always by political scientist Paul Buchanan. And in this episode, Paul and I are going to examine the United States and in particular, how the world is engaging with the United States geopolitically, what has changed in this regard in 2024, and we will consider whether some leaders of global, regional and even small powers are preparing for a possibility of a second Donald Trump presidency. And importantly at this juncture, we're going to consider, are some leaders central to conflict in the world today regarding the Biden administration as having entered a lame duck period? Now, they may be very early on assessing it in such ways. We're going to look into that. But before we deep dive into this issue, or these issues, if you like, remember, if you are joining us live right now via the social media platforms, do feel free to comment and we will include your questions and comments into this program. So let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who's waiting online to discuss this, and we'll just cross to him now. Kia ora koutou, Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, Selwyn. Thank you very much, and kia ora to you and the listeners as well. Sliding into winter over here on the west side of the Waitakere Ranges. But fortunately, we're not sliding physically, which has happened before. But good to be back, and interesting to talk about the state so early in the election campaign. I say that because we're still 6 months out. But I thought you had a good point when you suggested the segment, in that, we have an interesting vantage point. We live in the southwestern corner of the Pacific Ocean. We see the United States from the perspective of a very small country. Our whole view of how things work in the United States is considerably different than our American counterparts, or even people who come from Europe or other big countries, such as me way back in the day. And so what I thought I'd do, especially for the foreign listeners, is to pick up on something you said last year. You were the first person, at least to mention to me, and I read a fair bit, in November last year, you brought up the subject that if you are objective and you take a step back, right? You take that view from afar. The United States looks like an increasingly unstable polity. Socially and culturally, it may be what it is and stable. But politically speaking, it looks increasingly unstable. In fact, in some element, particularly on the right, it looks unhinged. That, I think, should be our framing device today. And then we can, burrow into American politics. But I think it's a great framing device because, I don't think you're wrong. I think you're absolutely correct. But also, look what has been going on around the world. Democratic leaders, particularly those in Europe, are already hedging against the possibility of Donald Trump coming back. And authoritarian leaders around the world are licking their lips at the prospect that this guy's somehow going to get back into office. And so, what it leaves people like me perplexed by is, how is this even close? How are the polls showing that Biden and Trump are running neck and neck, or Trump is ahead in several frontline states, as you will? I sit here and go, again, I read a fair bit, and I just don't get it, because the focus seems to be on Biden's physical frailty and his occasional old person lapses. Meanwhile, not only is Trump, sitting in court most of the week, and will face all these other trials, but he's increasingly ranting and raving like a lunatic at his rallies. He's also forgetful. He's also having his, mental challenges. But what he's saying is increasingly deranged. And that's what I don't get, is the man is unraveling. I mean, he's paying tributes to fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter and saying Hannibal Lecter was a good guy. This is nuts. And so, we shouldn't even have a close race, but at this early juncture, we appear to, and that's got to put fear into the hearts of Democrats worldwide.
Yeah, I think so. And Paul, I'll just bring up some of the things that you've just cited there too. We've got a screen here. Here we go. This came out overnight from the New York Times, and Ezra Klein, one of the opinion writers, has kind of dug into exactly where the polls are sitting. And I've just highlighted here for those that are watching the video, but I'll touch on it for those that are listening to just audio as well. And Ezra Klein writes, "It's not Joe Biden's poll numbers that worry me exactly. It's the denial of what's behind them." He is saying, among many voters, Biden is trailing Donald Trump by 1 point in Wisconsin, 3 points in Pennsylvania. Biden's ahead by a point in Michigan, sweeping those 3 states in one route to re-election. They're within reach. But he's saying here, and I'll quote actually, "Still Biden is losing to Trump. His path is narrowing. In 2020, Biden didn't just win Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He won Arizona, Georgia, Nevada. Now he's behind in those states by 6 points, 9 points, and 13 points in the latest New York Times, Siena, Philadelphia Acquirer poll," end of quote. Now, that is the crux of it. And this poll is a serious one. And it's also one that the New York Times is citing, Nate Silver's group, and where they're saying that they picked up that the polls were showing a strong Biden win last time. And the polls were generally, in their view, the most correct since 1998. And they're saying that was in the last presidential run. And it's kind of hinting that these polls may very well be accurate, and it may cause people by surprise. If any criticisms of the polls previously in the last presidential elections in 2020, it was that it didn't pick up the true strength of where the Republicans were, or the weaknesses of the Democrats. Now, they're saying in this context, it may be that the polls are incorrect, but they're actually incorrect in that they're not actually assessing the true drop in Democratic numbers. I think that's a fair, putting it into, general language. This is one of the crux of the problems here. So I'll just go back to our other thing here, Paul, and put it back to you that these are the kind of things that obviously are significant when people are trying to weigh up, is a possibility of a Trump second presidency a possibility, or is it starting to get closer over that line toward probability? And I guess we're still really stuck in that possibility area. And I know that you've got some very sound and analytical reasons for for you to suggest that people should hold their nose. And I'll pass it to you on that. And also then in the program, we'll start to look at what is happening geopolitically. How is the United States positioned in this part of 2024 compared to around December with its influence on regional powers? And is, that big question, are some authoritarian leaders and some that are crucial to world stability that are, I'm talking like in the Middle East at the moment, and Israel's handling of Gaza. It seems like Netanyahu turns to the United States with absolute overt indifference to where Biden's signalling has been in the last few weeks. I'm very keen to hear your evaluations on those. But back to these polls and how you regard it, and whether or not the polls are not considering a reality of the sensibilities that a voting public may have on election day.
Yeah, like I say, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet, but let's think of it this way. When you do these sort of polls, you're calling people up, and you may get 8 or 9 people who say, I don't follow politics. It's all the same to me, and what have you. So when you eventually get registered voters who express a preference one way or another, they're people like us. They're people who follow politics. It's a self-selected survey in that sense. And they've tried many ways to finesse it. No one uses landlines anymore except in rural sectors. So, they've been working the cell phone landline balance, excuse me. But I think that in the main, most people don't make up their minds until late October, early November, right? They're too busy with other things. And I can see it amongst my circle of friends in the States. Again, the political ones are, just like you and me. But those who aren't, they're rooted in, kids' little league. They're rooted in, the everyday occurrences that, are their lives. And they'll get to the decision down the road. Now, that's where I have a bias of hope in favor of Biden. I mean, I make no apologies that I think Trump is a danger and that Biden may be not the optimal choice, but he's certainly the better choice at this point. But I think that a lot of people will get down to late October. And mind you, this is in spite of the fact that those authoritarians you mentioned, particularly the Russians, the Chinese, but people like Netanyahu, will interfere in the U.S. elections on behalf of Donald Trump. They will do everything possible to frame narratives that cast Biden in the worst light possible.
So glad, sorry, I just wanted to say, so glad that you've raised this particular point, because it's an unknown as to what influence that will have. We know in past elections it's been significant. Just back to you, Paul.
Yeah, and I know that the U.S. intelligence services are acutely concerned about this. We can already see it in some of the narrative framing going on in right-wing media in the United States. I'll give you an example. Out of the blue, you were mentioning earlier that to me that COVID seems to have abated as a major concern for Americans, and naturally so. Although there are new variants out there, I mean, it has not gone away. But out of the blue, some right-wing media outlets began calling for the prosecution of Anthony Fauci because of his connections through the National Institute of Health to the laboratory in Wuhan province from which they think the virus escaped. And so there's this whole sidebar to go after Fauci and to dredge up the ghosts of the past, the people who, rather than Trump, were blamed for the pandemic response. You see, Trump, he is a Teflon Don. Instead of blaming, him and his stupidity about bleach and sun rays and whatnot, they want to go after these folks. And it's that sort of thing. I mean, it's only going to increase. And if you can get enough gullible people to focus on those distractions, obviously the border will become a major issue in right wing narratives. We're going to be inundated with obviously mostly people of color. They don't seem to mind white folk coming across the border. That's going to, happen in spades. On the other hand, I think that the pressure of the trials, uh, everything indicates from the rallies that he's having on his weekends free, are getting increasingly unhinged. And I think he may say or do something so outrageous in the lead up, but particularly in October, as we get into the last 6 weeks of the campaign, that may turn out to be a tipping point. But my ultimate reason that for belief that Biden may prevail is that I think that people wait until the end. Most people wait until the end. They look at the status quo. They see Trump on the one hand, they see Biden on the other, and I think that most will vote for Biden. Now, there is a couple of things that there's a lot of things Biden has to be worried about because his lack of popularity as a president, a person, is not replicated in Senate and House of Representatives and governorship races. The Democrats are actually holding their own in all those other offices. The Senate could be iffy there if they can hold on, but they may well reclaim the House of Representatives because of the
Yeah.
disaster that has been
These
the
same
Republican
polls
majority.
these same polls that we've been citing here, particularly led by the New York Times, they are showing exactly what you're talking about. They're showing that the Democrats are actually doing quite well in this early polling within those states, like what you say for the governorships, from the Senate, House of Representatives areas in particular. Down deeper into that, it's a little bit opaque at the moment. But in those areas, it would suggest on this that the I will not vote for Joe faction is significant for whatever reason. And it's probably not a 1, 2, and 3 reason. It's probably, one would imagine, like in all complex things like political elections and where choice will be displayed. There are many, many kind of things, not to mention the zeitgeist, this unfathomable movement that seems to sweep through societies at different times. So I just wanted to just reinforce what you're saying there and some interesting things. Let's just bring back up on screen for those that are watching too, if I can here. Once again, this is New York Times most recently. Asking its selection of 1,000 people spread across the nation. That sample of voters is obviously small and open to major swings because of statistically it's so small in a United States context. But having said that, it's asking, what one thing do you remember most about Donald Trump's presidency? Some people say his honesty. Others say his lies. So you see how polarised things in such ways are. He had the country headed in the right direction, as another comment. America was going in the wrong direction, says another. He was a crook, says one. He couldn't be bought, says another. Efficient, incompetent, less division. He divided the country. This speaks volumes as to where you opened and with respect to those conversations that we've had in A View from Afar going back to November last year, where instability within not just the politic, not just within the security, intelligence, defence areas and how it seems that the politic actually washes over into those areas, but even within the population on how it is determining the strengths and weaknesses of its own leadership. So I just come back. I just wanted to bring that forward, Paul, because it really puts some numbers in there with the condition and proviso there that people are aware that that's a sample of 1,000 people over the whole of the United States that the New York Times is raising here.
Right. And I would use the physical analogy, someone who has dealt with athletic injuries and what have you. Think of this polarity as your two legs being fundamentally unstable because of arthritis or injuries and whatnot, and your knees are going in different directions. They're going
Yeah.
sideways. Uh, that polarization is the equivalent of arthritis in someone's legs. It makes you very unstable, right? You walk generally, I mean, you're physically unstable because your knees won't go in the right direction. That's how I see it. I think that the instability is fundamentally a product of the polarization, and the product of polarization has both natural origins, but it also has unnatural origins in the form of disinformation campaigns and the like. Now, again, I think that as we get into October, it's very possible that remember Trump is talking about. Well, let's back up on this one. We haven't mentioned this, but we might as well put all our cards on the table. I believe that no matter who wins in November, there will be violence in the United States. Trump will not accept a loss, and he will call on his people to hit the streets. He's got a better plan to deal with loss in terms of usurping it. I mean, he's got the Heritage Foundation behind him. Anyway, there's a blueprint to not make the so-called mistakes that led to January 6th and him having to leave. So that means that if Biden wins, there's going to be serious trouble. On the other hand, if Trump wins, he has said he's going to exact revenge on his political enemies and anyone else who gets in his way. I mean, he really is a mobster. And he's going to use the Justice Department as his preferred weapon. So the irony is he says now that the U.S. Justice Department is weaponized against him, but that's just classic projection. That's what he's going to do should he win. But either way, Biden wins or Trump wins, there's going to be violence in November. And I think that a lot of the American public, when they see what he says he's going to do, he said that, I'll only be an authoritarian for one day. Well, what does that one day entail? A bunch of executive orders ordering the arrest of your political opponents? I mean, it's a very weird comment because he said, the questioning, I think, came from a Fox News talking head was like, you're not really going to be authoritarian, are you? And he said, well, no, just for one day. I think a lot of voters will go, whoa, we've had enough of this. I mean, there's a lot of craziness has gone on in the last 6 years or so. And meanwhile, Biden may be doddering, but the country's stable. The country is economically, even though it's framed as not being economically prosperous, objectively it is. I mean, the Dow Jones went over 40,000 for the first time ever. When Biden came to office, it was below 20,000, the index. So objective measures tell you that economically the U.S. is doing quite well, but there is that old problem of people voting against their economic interests because of some perceived personality issue and that sort of thing. You would think working class people would not vote for Trump because he's the billionaire's friend. But he scratches an itch, the itch of racism, xenophobia, prejudice, and unfortunately people respond to it. More substantively, something. Yeah, let me leave this line. Last week, the auto workers at a Mercedes plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, voted against unionization. The vote was close. Out of 5,000 some odd workers, there was a difference of 600. Most of these workers are African Americans, and they voted against their self-interest over the longer term. And so they didn't look beyond all the incentives that Mercedes was throwing at them to not unionize, right? They went for the gold ring that was, the shiny object proffered in front of them. That's trouble for Biden because Biden is the most pro-union president the U.S. has ever had. Biden is, as always, fashioned himself as a champion of the blue collar working class and of African Americans. In fact, he was at Morehouse College, one of the historically black colleges in the United States, giving their commencement address yesterday. And if he's got trouble with African American workers in Alabama, which admittedly is a very reactionary state, on a bread and butter issue like collective representation, that's trouble. I mean, that as Democratic strategists better be looking at. Now, workers in California voted to unionize in another auto factory, but California is a liberal state and all that sort of thing. I use the Alabama example because I don't think that he will win Georgia or Alabama. I think Georgia was a one-off, traditionally Republican state that he managed to win last time. I don't think he's going to win there. Alabama's always been Republican, at least, since the turn back in the day, whenever that was, when they went from Democratic to Republican. But the fact that again, this is the core of his support, or traditionally been his support. He and his strategists need to think about that, because Pennsylvania has the same type of voter, Michigan has the same type of voter. So that, I would say, that's a real red flag.
Those Rust
that,
Belt kind of areas that were lost to Trump in 2016, that obviously took the Democrats by a huge surprise. And a lot of evaluation obviously followed that with the Democrats, and looking at, we've become too corporatized as a representative party, etc., to lose to Trump in these areas that we consider to be safe. And it was almost like those ideas of Democrats having strong holds into the Panhandle in Florida, for example. There's no way it was getting those kind of shifts in that area, if I remember correctly, in 2016. So getting back to this too, you touched on, this Alabama example is probably within frame of this particular thing. Elections outside of the United States have picked up some, in my mind, some determining factors in the outcomes in the post pandemic period. In New Zealand, for example, we saw a situation here in New Zealand where very clear and decisive votes were shifting away from the incumbents. And it appeared that that drive was not necessarily a vote that was saying, I prefer this party over here or that group of parties over here, but rather a vote against the incumbents and a dissatisfaction with what was happening in their lives. If that is accurate, we perhaps can see that there's some merit in this argument from the point of view that subsequent polls, once there's been a change of government, the population does not necessarily seem to be that satisfied with the new government. The no Hollywood period, albeit, in the New Zealand context, despite what the new incumbent government says, it is embarked on an austerity program. But the point being that there seems to be shifts in the way people vote more significantly than in past decades. In my view, I'd argue that they're voting against something as opposed to for something, certainly within the New Zealand context there. Now, that's subjective and open for debate, and I'd encourage it to be so if people so wish to. But Paul, maybe that you're seeing signs of that within the United States at a different level, within the workplace, in these areas that you would normally see a vote going one particular direction, it's actually going in the other. And perhaps, like you put it very well there, the gold ring kind of element is part of the driver, but maybe there is a change in the psyche of the way voting publics are expressing their dissatisfactions as opposed to preferences. So getting back to this, unless you want to add some more, I'll just open it to you to tidy up where we are with the polling and where things may be trending, and start to look at what is the reaction within the world. We've introduced to our audience earlier on in this episode that there are authoritarian leaders, but also other leaders that are leaders of significant histories in being with the United States on strategic things like Israel, for example, and we've got Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, there basically indifferent to Joe Biden's calls on different things, to the point where you've got public gesturing from the United States saying, well, we'll cut the arms flow in these particular areas to Israel should this not go in the way we wish and expect it to do so. So, Paul, back into your realm here, let's take us through those steps to get an idea of how the United States is being regarded and certainly where it may land later in this year. And the big question, is it being regarded by many influential leaders as being in a Joe Biden presidency lame duck period, and basically the possibility of a Trump win has shifted in their minds across to probability?
Okay, let me start off by finishing the discussion about Biden's domestic politics. The big problem for them is what percentage of voters are voters who will vote anyone but Joe Biden. Now, that includes not just people who will actively vote for Trump or for John F. Kennedy Jr., but also people who will abstain and just sit that one out because they don't like Biden and they can't bring themselves to vote for Trump. Now, we have to understand Biden has made some mistakes that have made this problem more acute. Again, the anything but Biden problem. He has alienated the Muslim American community with his support for Israel. That has now leached out into the African American community. The African American community historically has had very mixed relations with the Jewish community for all the reasons we know. I mean, very bad conspiracies, the whole kit and caboodle. At Morehouse College yesterday, a number of those young African American graduates turned their backs on Joe Biden in symbolic repudiation of his support for Israel. I mean, this was made, openly, was stated by organizers of the silent protest. This is a major problem, that you said it earlier. You said, oh, the Democrats have sort of realized that they've got to shift their corporate orientation in order to keep blue collar workers because they become too obvious and that they're beholden to Silicon Valley, that they're just Republican light when it comes to Wall Street. I think, Selwyn's got a point there with the corporates, but it's as true for the Israel lobby as well. Biden and the Democrats are too tied to the Israeli lobby to extricate themselves in a subtle and comfortable way before this election. Something may happen afterwards, but right now, they don't want to turn their backs on Israel, no matter what Israel does. And they're trying to hint to Netanyahu that he's got to take it easy. He's got to, come on. Although I think it's too late for that. And Netanyahu, on the other hand, wants to get rid of Biden. He wants Trump back. So he's not going to be cooperative at all in the run up to that. In fact, he's going to be more difficult. And this was shown again yesterday when a MAGA Republican Congresswoman, Elaine Stefanik from New York, spoke to the Knesset and openly insulted Biden and U.S. foreign policy in front of these Israeli parliamentarians, most of whom were, hardcore Orthodox people that are part of Netanyahu's coalition. This is not good for Biden on so many levels. And so he's got to do something. What that may be, beyond the pause and sending, bombs, which was symbolic but did nothing. He signed a bill for $6 billion worth of weaponry the day after they announced the pause, this weaponry going to Israel. And so therein, I think, lies his big problem. It's not going to make people vote for Trump it's going to make people not vote at all because they're disgusted with his inability to move the marker on this tail that wags the dog known as Israel. So he's got his work cut out for him, although I would argue that most American voters still see him as the default option simply because Trump is looking increasingly like a nutter. Now, we flip it to the external world. We talked about strategic hedging, or we at least made reference to it. Right now, everybody is hedging on the US elections. Democrats around the world are hoping for Biden to hang in there, but are preparing for the worst because that's what you have to do as a leader is, hope for the best. And so they're looking, this may actually strengthen NATO and strengthen the EU because they've got to look increasingly to themselves. Because if Trump comes in, it's very, very possible that he will remove the United States from NATO, with all that entails. He simply is too myopic and too vengeful to understand that NATO is actually very good for the United States. He simply does not have that type of mindset. So around the world, the Democrats, particularly those who have some measure of stability, will start looking to each other and hedge against the possibility of a Trump presidency. Now, mind you, a lot of democracies around the world have hardened over the last decade. I think of my adopted country, Argentina, who's got this crazy man running it now. And he loves the United States. He loves Trump. He can't wait till Trump comes back. And so there are those type of people, not just the Viktor Orbáns of the world, not just the Vladimir Putins, of those guys who obviously want Trump in because they can manipulate him. But there are hard Democrats, if you will, around the world who see in him the useful fool that he is. Biden may be doddering, but he's no fool, and his team are no fools. But if you look at what Trump has surrounding him, again, he has his daughter-in-law who sings country western music songs badly as the head of the Republican National Committee. He's trying to build this little fiefdom of imbeciles and incompetence. And so I think if you're one of those more hard-leaning, democratically elected leaders, you may see this as a window of opportunity to extract concessions from the United States on any number of issues. We now know Trump lined his pocket as president, which you're not supposed to do, but, he managed to finesse it. I think that, the reaction worldwide will be very mixed, fearful and guarded on the part of liberal Democrats the world over, including here. I think even though we have a right-wing government in power right now, an unstable United States led by an unstable leader is problems for us. The ripple effects, if you will, if you want to use the big pond analogy, those ripples emanating from the United States are going to wash over us, anywhere from climate change things to actually, balance of power politics in the Western Pacific. And we're in the middle of it then. And authoritarians or authoritarian-minded people around the world, leaders also, will see this as a moment of opportunity, because it's a special moment of opportunity, because it's a moment of weakness of the United States led by a shallow leader who can be manipulated. And so they're going to go for it. They are absolutely going to go for it. And the question is, will, I won't say common sense, because I don't purport to, read people's minds or, think, what is good for me is good for them. But if the United States voting public abstains in large numbers, Trump gets his MAGA 30%, right? Because these people, it's the people he said he could shoot someone on Park Avenue and they'll still follow him around. He's going to get that 30%. And so the question is, what happens to the other, 70%? Will they abstain? In which case, Biden's in serious trouble. I don't think that RFK Jr. is going to steal a lot of votes from Biden. That's the way it's being framed. I think to the contrary, because he's an anti-vaxxer, he's got
and
a few
the
screws
brainworm
loose
wouldn't
too,
have helped.
that he may pull.
Sorry about that, but he having said that, over the weekend, it does seem that he's registering around about 10% support in these New York Times-led polls. So, that sounds like there's a dissatisfaction vote as opposed to a serious vote for Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's the anyone but Biden vote. Although I still think that if you look at, policy-wise and personality-wise, it would seem to me that RFK would pull voters off of Trump. I mean, everybody, it's the Kennedy name, and the Kennedys are, Democratic royalty, but this guy is not it. Okay, this guy's got a lot of bad baggage, and again, he's got a few screws loose. He's a conspiracy theorist. That's Trump's crowd. That's not your mainstream Democratic voters. And the one other thing is that Biden needs to do something to appease the left wing of the Democratic Party, because that left wing is growing in strength because of the inequality that exists in the states, the increasing racial tensions. I mean, the U.S. in a way is socially regressing, at least as far as I can see it, from afar, to a place they don't want to go. Maybe the MAGA guys want to go there, where white men rule over everybody else. But I would say the majority of people, let's say my adult children in the States, they certainly don't want a future that looks like the 1950s past. And so that's just it. Crunch time will come in October. Meanwhile, we're going to have trials. We're obviously going to have scandals, insanity, disinformation of all sorts. And out of that mix, one cannot predict right now possibilities, much less probabilities. But I think you're absolutely right in saying we can't discard the fact that Trump is in with a shot on the national elections because of the concerns about Biden, both the spurious ones about his age, and then the significant or substantive ones about his policies, particularly with regards to Israel and Palestine.
Okay, so let's dig down a bit deeper into the impact that it has had and all of this instability, the unknowns, if you like, in a time where perhaps many states and countries in the world would require look for stability amongst some of the leading nations, in particular the United States. So let's look at the impact that all of this has had in 2024, and even from the point of view of strategic defence security developments like the AUKUS agreements that are, shaping to impact containment. And, the United States led interest in containing China in the South China Sea and in the Western Pacific even. So what is all the signal to countries that are burgeoning members, considering the joining of AUKUS, for example? We know that Japan is right there. We know Canada is right there. We certainly know that New Zealand is being courted and is considering in a most significant way Pillar 2 membership of AUKUS. And just to remind those that aren't perhaps aware of what this AUKUS thing is, it's the Australian, United Kingdom and the United States Security Defence Pact that is destined to operate significantly in the Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific region, I should say, in primary considerations there. So with New Zealand, for example, we've had discussions exactly on this point going back in November last year. My situation is here that our discussion today and looking at the instability of the United States, not just within the politic, but its pillar institutions as well. That sends those instability signals to countries like New Zealand, and that they surely at the highest level must be modelling out the prospect of a very possible Donald Trump-led United States administration. And if not, modelling out the destabilisation that is inevitable, as you've alluded to in your comments relating to the post-election chaos that could and most likely would occur should Trump lose. So where does that leave countries in this situation, Paul? What do you believe countries like New Zealand and even Japan and Canada, how should they hedge themselves in their considerations for what may come to pass?
Well, it's important, when you sign treaties and formal alliances, particularly security alliances, you try to lock them in for a period of time that extends well beyond the signatory government's tenure in office. The idea is they're open-ended in time, and there's a lot of detail to them because it's in a way a means of preventing subsequent governments from reneging on the promises made in the agreements or the treaties or whatever they may be. Now, here we have an interesting complication. I mean, your question actually raises some interesting sidebars. We've always known about private versus public diplomacy, and let's just say, to keep things simple, so public diplomacy will call what embassies do, right? You have an ambassador, the formal relationship between, let's say, the state of New Zealand and the United States. Increasingly, because of social media and whatnot, you have private diplomacy, which isn't, the quiet backdoor stuff that occurs between states, but now is the diplomacy that is done by private entities to each other. So, for example, the Atlas Foundation funds and provides talking points for right-wing organizations around the world. Steve Bannon has his own network of media channels, including here in New Zealand. And what's interesting is that our right-wing government, because it's not right-center in its behavior, is parroting U.S. talking points to a point that makes me cringe, because we are not a mini United States. But the language, particularly of the minority parties in this coalition, is scarily American, but right-wing American. So they're bringing their culture wars to New Zealand. Culture wars that, we didn't originate here. We have nothing to do with, but yet they're here because right-wingers see leverage being accrued by going after gay people and whatever the American right thinks is bad, wokeness and that stuff. We see it here. I mean, I know you're well aware of this. Now, I think these right-wing people in government really believe that it would be okay for Trump to win, because then you'd have a kindred spirit in the White House and he would be nice to us. And I think you are fools if you believe that.
Yeah.
Because
Just
he doesn't
think of
even
Malcolm
think of New
Turnbull in
Zealand.
that area, Paul. Remember Malcolm Turnbull in 2016 thought,
Yeah.
okay, I'll establish some sort of relationship with this new president, Donald Trump. Gets on the phone to him to congratulate him on his win and is basically insulted for about half an hour. Ends up having to find a way to get off the phone line to salvage his own self-esteem. Just putting some nuts and bolts and reality back to that point you made.
Yeah, no, and that's Australia, which is 100 times bigger than us. Now, I know that Trump has mentioned that he has heard that New Zealand has good golf courses. That's not good for us. But more importantly, not only does he not know where we are, but he could very well disengage the United States from its external commitments to include AUKUS. I mean, we may not have to worry so much, but if you're the Philippines, you're Japan, you're South Korea, you're a frontline state when it comes to containing China. This is a problem because Trump has made very clear he would like to withdraw the United States from many of its international security commitments. Now, I happen to buck the trend or swim against the tide of those here in New Zealand who believe that we have a shot at entering AUKUS Pillar 2. I think that's wishful thinking on the part of our diplomats and military defense establishment. We'd like to be able to ride on the coattails of the AUKUS partners when it comes to sharing high technology, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, all that stuff. I think it's basically just wishful thinking because not only do we not have any economies of scale in those fields, whereas Australia, Britain, and the United States have well developed military industrial complexes already, and being capitalism being a competitive business, why would they want to share with non-nuclear New Zealand? We haven't lifted a finger when it comes to security arrangements of that sort. And so it seems to me a bit pie in the sky to think that we're going to get a look in. More importantly, it's now very clear. We've known for a while that Japan is going to get invited into the Five Eyes partnership. There's Japan. Japan is going to become a member of Five Eyes. That's a really big deal. But Japan, with its economies of scale, will be invited into AUKUS because Japan has now revised its constitution. It's no longer a pacifist state, and it has nuclear power. They're already over the hurdle of nuclear things. They won't want nuclear weapons, but the Japanese are not averse to nuclear powered submarines and that stuff in their waters. And so the most likely partner for Pillar 2 in this region is Japan, not New Zealand. And that's why I think there's a lot, maybe our foreign friends don't understand how heated the debates have gotten here between New Zealand pacifists, some elements of the Labour Party, which of course it was the Labour Party that declared New Zealand's non-nuclear status back in the 80s, and then right-wing security commentators who think the sooner we get in bed with our bigger partners, the better for everybody. Well, I think that option won't materialize because the Japanese have got the fast track in there. That's where the Japanese have to worry. A Trump presidency runs the risk of seeing the Americans put the kibosh on all of that because Trump simply doesn't see the need to have these security alliances. Now, I know that AUKUS, the submarine side, has been almost etched in stone because that doesn't, that actually involves 40, 50-year commitments to build these boats and host them in Australia. I don't see Trump getting out of those agreements very easily. On the other hand, Pillar 2, they haven't even written down the details of what it's going to be like. And so that's an easy one to discard, particularly when it comes to an insignificant state like New Zealand, at least in his eyes. So I think the big risk here is that because of his neo-isolationist viewpoint, because he's so transactional in his view to things, that the countries that are at greatest risk from a Trump presidency are U.S. allies, not U.S. adversaries. And that should be worrisome. And then if we add in the possibility that Trump is in the pocket of Vladimir Putin, which has not been fully disproven as of yet, his presidency could be serious trouble for the United States as a great power.
Well, thank you for that. It really it drew out, my thinking too. And I feel that there are significant things that we will obviously watch as the election continues on. Paul, we've got some excellent comments that have come in once again from one of our favourite commentators on A View from Afar, David Mooring. And I'll just bring up a few of them, and there's three in particular. Let's see if you can address some of these, and I'll just bring up on screen for those that are watching and read out for those that are listening. And David Mooring says, is it possible to, and how do we burst the unreality bubble, as he puts it, that Trump and Kennedy supporters have found themselves in? So let's just address that, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Well, the only way to burst these bubbles is to expose them for the frauds and charlatans that they are. Now, Trump has got these series of trials. I'll say this again. I mean, he did manage to stack the deck so that the judge overseeing his classified documents trial is someone he appointed, even though she had no experience whatsoever, as in zero, in a courtroom prior to him naming her a federal court judge. She's made a number of incredibly bad rulings that may eventually result in her being removed from the case. But I say all of this because, to my mind, he's got the January 6th trial, he's got the classified documents trial, he's got the voter fraud trial in Georgia, although the Georgian prosecutors have hijacked themselves because of two of them had an affair, and anyway, they've made that a lot less likely. But the big ones are, what was his degree of involvement in the January 6th riots? And then what on earth was he doing with this sensitive classified information?
Yeah. And the
If
classified
any of that
information
percolates up
has been
between
postponed,
now,
hasn't it?
right, and what they're saying is it won't go to trial until after the election. And of course, let's be very clear what the stakes are. If he wins, he can pardon himself, right? He can basically whitewash the whole thing. So, yeah, of the federal charges. This is serious business. I mean, he can basically pardon himself. He's said as much. I mean, he's said things to the effect that he's not that worried because he's going to win, and then he's just going to clean the slate. I think, though, that the prosecutors will push to at least start introducing into the public domain the seriousness of some of the stuff that was uncovered. And of course, we've talked about it because in the intelligence circles, it's a fairly open secret that he had payroll records of CIA covert officers at Mar-a-Lago. How he got covert operatives' payroll records is unknown at this point, but very scary. And if any of that comes out, then security conservatives in the United States may start to rethink, this strongman image that he tries to project. And then, of course, if there's more involvement proven on his part with the January 6th conspirators, like the Proud Boys, then that may actually make some conservative Republicans rethink their commitment to him. I mean, again, the MAGA people will never change. Bobby Kennedy basically just needs to have his record reviewed in the public transcript because he's not well. And remember, there are people out there who know that when he went to Tonga in the mid-teens, he was advocating against measles vaccines. He's a full anti-vaxxer, and I don't know the exact number, but 100 Tongan kids died of the measles because people believed him. He was a Kennedy, of course. It had to be true. And so all of this has to be brought out in the public records so we understand what we're dealing with here. not a
So those are
well
the
person.
bubble
And then
popper.
if they go back and get into the, well, that's how you pop them. You
Yeah,
know, in
and
answer of
sorry,
David's first question, is that's how you pop them. You just expose them.
apology for coming over the top of you. We've got a little bit of an audio lag just has been plaguing there. But David Mooring just picked up with a question here, something just I think we should clarify here, and it's respect to our comments relating to the pardons of federal charges. Now, in my understanding, that with federal charges, there's the ability for a president to pardon, even if it's themselves. But there's a legal view and opinion that the president, whoever is elected, cannot pardon on state convictions. That be correct, Paul?
That is correct. All right. So see, but he's, again, this guy, it's amazing how he wiggles out of things. Uh, he can pardon himself on the January 6th riot involvement. He can pardon himself on the classified documents thing. He can't pardon himself on this Stormy Daniels, cover up fraud trial that he's going through right now. And he can't pardon himself on the Georgia state charges of voter fraud. Now, again, those prosecutors have done themselves in. So I don't think he has to worry about Georgia anymore. He's going to appeal the Stormy Daniels trial if he loses, and that'll go on forever. He'll just appeal and appeal, trying to get over the bar of the November elections, and then try to find a sympathetic ear somewhere in the judicial system that will say that he cannot go to jail or whatever over the. It's essentially bank fraud, the cover up of the payments to Stormy Daniels. Um, but in short, anything federal he can pardon himself for, and he can pardon others. Uh, Anything state is out of his hands unless he is able to convince state authorities to drop charges or to grant him a pardon. So, for example, if this Stormy Daniels thing had been brought up, let's say in Texas courts, I can guarantee you that if he was found guilty, Governor Abbott would pardon him immediately because Governor Abbott is a very reactionary Republican of the MAGA persuasion. So he still has many lives left.
All
But
of
I
this
think
is
that the best thing
what
to
I was.
do, and to
Sorry, Paul. All of this is what I was alluding
go
to
ahead.
before when I talked about the destabilisation of the US pillar institutions, because we do see destabilisation relating to continual commitments to, say, or sustainable commitments to justice and the ideals of justice being jaundiced by the political apparatus, and that's what I was getting at back there. Another question that came in from David Mooring here, and it was picking up on when we were talking about AUKUS, but I'll bring it up here anyway in case there's elements of something you'd like to address, Paul. And what it is saying here is, David says, speaking of AUKUS and subs, have you seen Perron's The Future of the Submarine, Emerging Threats, Sensors and Transparent Oceans? And he goes on also to say, are there too many players in the China Sea claiming areas for it not to become a hotspot? And he's saying, obviously, is it that so many irons are in the fire with respect to territorial rights that it's inevitable that things are so hot in that area?
Yeah, well, I'll agree that in the South China Sea, conflict is inevitable. Uh, uh, there are too many actors playing. I think that what's going to happen, it's a perverse version of domino theory. The Chinese will finally kill a Filipino sailor one way or another in the disputes about Filipino fishing rights in what is nominally considered to be their territorial waters and EEZ. That will precipitate the security guarantees offered by the United States, and then we'll have the entrance of peer competitors in that region. the only thing stopping the conflict right now is the Chinese are not yet ready to take on the United States and its allies in a pure war. That's also what's holding them back from going after Taiwan when they can use much more subtle measures, including cyber warfare. Chinese aren't quite up there yet when it comes to big maritime confrontations. And that's part of what the United States is doing, is working to what we've mentioned in the past, which is this mini-lateralist strategy. It's forming little defensive alliances with the Philippines, with Japan. I shouldn't say little, but they're doing a lot of bilaterals. But what it means is the parties are committed to defending each other in the event of aggression by a hostile power, i.e. the PRC. And so I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to have a domino effect or a cascade effect where it'll start small with, it could be even anything as simple as a Chinese cutter running over one of those Filipino wooden fishing boats and killing people. Now the Filipinos have to respond, and they will. And then the Chinese, you get into tit for tat. At some point, the Americans and their allies will have to step in, and then we've got a hot war. And the question is, can that be limited in any way, shape, or form? Your guess is as good as mine at this point. What was the second thing that David asked?
I'll just bring it back
There was
up.
one about the South China Sea.
Yeah, he's saying, are there too many irons in the fire? Basically, he says, are there too many players in the South China Sea claiming areas for it not to become a hotspot?
Well, also, David, let's be very clear. There's only one actor in the South China Sea claiming territory in it, and that's the People's Republic of China. Everybody else, including the International Court of Justice, have ruled that China's 9-dash line demarcation of the South China Sea as one of its territorial waters is illegal. It has no standing in international law or maritime law. So the claims to the Scarborough Shoals and other outcrops, which now the Chinese, against what they said in the early teens, militarized, and now, unbelievably, there are credible reports that they are going to build nuclear reactors on these Chinese bases. Essentially, they lied all the way along. That was the grievous mistake of the Obama administration. Back in the day, they took the Chinese at their word and got played like fools. Now we're presented with the fait accompli of Chinese military bases in what should be Filipino territorial waters. We have Chinese petroleum exploration going on in Vietnamese waters and Indonesian waters, for that matter. And we won't say anything about the fishing fleets that have been thrown out there. And so the Chinese are the only ones who are staking claims that are unjustified. Especially the Scarborough Shoals, that's Filipino water, traditionally
and
speaking.
Perhaps we can understand
they
too
very
why.
adroitly.
Perhaps we can understand why there is such tensions in shipping lanes, transit lines, etc., when we look at the global picture as well. Why is this intensifying through 2023, 2024? When you look at, for example, the problems with the Panama Canal at the moment, so getting ships through there is being limited because of climate issues. We look at the security, defence and conflict issues in the Middle East, where we've got the Suez Canal under all sorts of things. Even prior to that, we had congestion issues, mainly, once again, Panama. So, when you've got an export led global economy like China that is dependent on its shipping lanes and those kind of areas, perhaps an overreaction in some people's minds relating to the South China Sea starts to actually come into play. And then there's the complexities like you've talked about clearly with respect to Taiwan. Paul, there's just a comment here that's coming through. I'll touch on the comments as opposed to a question from Matthew Grace. Matthew says, I think New Zealand, Canada, Japan will be a part of AUKUS. Trump has stated his support for AUKUS. Well, yeah, Paul will address that point, but in my view, what we've seen is Donald Trump really advancing the United States' interests through withdrawing from such things, and isolationism being one of the determining definitions of a Trump-led administration from the past and what we would expect in the future. So with respect to the longevity of AUKUS under a Trump-led White House, my vote would go on what Paul was saying, and that it, in the very least it'd be destabilised to the point of chaos, and and the most reality kind of part on the spectrum would be that the withdrawal or irrelevance from the point of view of the United States under a Trump-led one would want so much defence budgets by those members that would be a part of it that it would be no longer sustainable. But Paul, that's my view on it. Back to you on it.
Yeah, look, I think that Japan is definitely going to be in AUKUS. I mean, that much I believe. Whether it's Pillar 2 or Pillar 1 down the road, I'm not sure about Pillar 1, but Pillar 2 definitely. Because remember, Pillar 2, with all that high-tech improvements and economies of scale, that goes in very neatly with Five Eyes. See, a lot of that stuff will be used for signal and technical intelligence gathering purposes. And let's remember, submarines happen to be formidable intelligence gathering platforms. So I see that. The Canadians, it's interesting because we're talking about 5 liberal democracies here. I don't think it's a guarantee that the Canadian voting public will want a bar of AUKUS, certainly Pillar 1. They don't have nuclear submarines. I mean, I happen to have a friend who is a Canadian sailor, and they're quite content with the fleet that they have. They have very tense relationships with the People's Republic because of some misbehavior on the part of the PRC in Canada. And if it's perceived that AUKUS would increase those tensions, it's very possible that the Canadians would say, you know what, we'll pass on this one. Although they too would obviously be interested in Pillar 2. Here, you just made me think, if we had a vote today in New Zealand about joining Pillar 2, if it was an offer was extended to it, I'm not entirely sure that the voting public would accept that. I think there's enough resistance and the historical legacy of our non-nuclear policy that it wouldn't be a shoo-in at all.
But I'd add on top of that too.
The New Zealand public would say, yeah.
I'd add on top of that too that, yeah, definitely those that advocated the common sense approach that New Zealand took relating to denuclearisation within our legislative agendas and from the 1980s. David Lange, Prime Minister at the time, obviously front-footing that particular ideology, if you want to call it such. But what we're also seeing here in New Zealand is those former Prime Ministers, former leaders of the right parties, former Prime Minister John Key, obviously a significant Prime Minister for a 3-term Prime Minister there, actually saying we shouldn't go into AUKUS, that China is still so significant as a trade partner that we just shouldn't touch this AUKUS. Then you've got Don Brash, the former governor of the New Zealand Reserve Bank, who became the leader of the ACT Party and was once, unsuccessfully contested the New Zealand general election for the leadership as a leader of the National Party. He's saying there's no empirical reason for New Zealand to poke the tiger, if you like, that China and New Zealand's relationship is too strategic and tactically important for New Zealand to join AUKUS. So you've got not just those that perhaps sat on the centre left, and certainly with the peace elements of the New Zealand way of life, supporting this particular thing, but also those who are on trade-led zealots, if you like, in such ways too. And remember that New Zealand, with respect to the last alliance that it was in with the United States, many in New Zealand felt very, very uncomfortable about the forward commitment elements of an alliance. And I think that spectre really attacks New Zealand's perception of an independent policy and an independent voice in global affairs, albeit small. So that's my take on it. There's another comment, and perhaps we just wrap up on this one, Paul, with your response and any last word from you on our discussions today. Once again, David Moran, and he says, but will China really surrender such valuable export markets which it would lose getting into a conflict for such little economic gain? And he's got in brackets sans guns of August reasoning here.
Well, here's the trouble for Xi Jinping and the other leadership of the CCP. They have backed themselves into a corner. They have struck in a very forceful military diplomatic pose, particularly with regards to what they have now continually said to be China's territorial sea. This is no longer international waters in their mindset. This is all Chinese, right up to the 12-mile limit of all the littoral countries around it, including Brunei, including Malaysia. That's pretty strong rhetoric. And what it has done is it has created a wave of right-wing patriotic sentiment in China that sees any backing off, any compromise, any allowance for the views of those littoral countries, much less the United States, much less a traditional enemy like Japan, to be weakness, to be cowardice. So he's now backed in a corner with regards to the ultra-nationalists, a fair few who reside inside his military. And so he can't back out of a confrontation, even if it will jeopardize Chinese trade over the short term. Right now, he can't afford a confrontation because the Chinese economy is in considerable difficulties. And I was reading just recently about how they're trying to dump electric vehicles around the world because they've got such a surplus at home and the Chinese consumers are not buying them. So it all started, my reading, with seeing the proliferation of Chinese vehicles here in New Zealand. I mean, it's been pretty amazing in the last year or so.
The Chinese EVs are pretty stunning and spectacular. I've been in one. They've got the rights to manufacture MG, the famous British brand. So it's clever stuff that's coming out of there. And if they're dumping on, you'd see many people arguing, well, isn't that good for the planet? You see the Biden administration coming back with applying arguably 100% tariffs on such things. Looks like they're very 20th century with respect to climate considerations. So it's complex on every angle, isn't it?
Right, and what that means is it's going to urge caution on the part of CCP leaders and military leaders to tell their boat commanders. Because again, these things usually start with a often junior officer in the bridge of a warship making a mistake. And things escalate from there. That's why they say miscalculation is, the mother of all wars. And so I would imagine that the People's Liberation Army Navy has sent out to its commanders, its fleet commanders, there are limits to what you're going to do if you're provoked by these, Filipino fishing vessels. Spray them with water, but don't shoot them. The spraying with water is bad enough on a wooden boat. But right now is not the time for China to start a conflict of any size, to be honest with you. But they cannot back down, particularly if the United States shows up to defend the rights of the Filipinos to fish in international waters around the Scarborough Shoals, we got the makings of a big problem, not just in terms of the world and great power conflict, but for the Communist Party leadership, because anything short of total victory will be seen as weakness and cowardice. So, I think that's why the leadership may want to proceed with caution right now until they feel that they're militarily superior, and that's several years away. But it's right now it's doubtful that they would engage in something that would impede trade and whatnot, since they desperately need it to offload all of this surplus material at home. But on the other hand, miscalculation is something that is happenstance, is spontaneous, and cannot be predicted in advance. Particularly, you have to remember some of these captains of the Coast Guard ships the Chinese are using are very young and very inexperienced, as in under the age of 30, with no experience, dealing with combat vessels and the like. And so there's always that potential that someone will make a bad mistake, and then things will escalate out of the control of any one country. And I can only hope that the CCP leadership is acutely cognizant of that fact.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. Thanks for the wrap up as well. And it's an interesting thing too, and perhaps there's a little bit of a flag that is indicating of future programs there, that when we begin the program looking at the United States and how the political elements are lining up, what it looks like, possibilities that could eventuate, but certainly the absolute hedging that some countries are doing at the moment. And we end up into an examination of the South China Sea, AUKUS, and the other global power that is obviously in existence here now, that's the People's Republic of China. I think you're indicating that we definitely need to dedicate a program that looks at such things, and no doubt we will. Now, Paul, I'll just say to the audience that's live here at the moment, and a significant number of people have come in via Twitter. One of the things that we like with a view from afar is the interaction elements. And I just say to you all that are watching it live, particularly those that are coming through on Twitter, that if you want to interact, that as you will see, YouTube is the best platform for that. X, formerly known as Twitter, is excellent for distributing our program. It isn't possible to actually see your comments should you wish to interact in the program. So my suggestion here is tuck over to YouTube, push the subscriber button, get notified of future episodes that we've got lined up, which should be in about 2 weeks, and we'll really welcome your comments and interaction into the program. In fact, we could very easily set a segment entirely for feedback and comments and reactions that are coming in, and that would make a very, very good podcast, both for those on demand that listen to it, but certainly for those that want to join in, take part, interact in the live context too. So with all that said and done, cross to YouTube, subscribe to the podcast on Evening Report's channel there, and push the notify button, and you'll be sweet for doing that in the future episodes. Look forward to that. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the audience out there. We really look forward to coming back to you to discuss things in depth and to follow global affairs and global geopolitics, security, defence issues. We'll do so, and we intend to do so in about 2 weeks' time. Until that time, ka kite anō. Take care out there. Be safe, people. Thank you very much for your time and sharing with us today.